Welcome to the Pod-Key Summary of Lone Survivor. Today's episode is about what makes Lone Survivor hit so hard, and why it still sparks argument. It's a war film built around brotherhood, physical realism, and one extraordinary act of compassion. But it's also a movie whose claim to truth gets a lot messier the closer you look. So the big picture here is pretty clear. The film works powerfully as an immersive account of a disastrous mission, even as questions linger about what it changes, what it leaves out, and what kind of war story it really wants to be. At the emotional center of the movie, Peter Berg wasn't really chasing a story about one invincible individual. He framed it as a story about brotherhood, sacrifice, and protecting the people next to you. The idea was that survival depends on collective commitment, on working for something bigger than your own ego, and that shows up both on-screen and behind the camera. The production itself echoed that mindset. People took pay cuts, military collaboration was built deeply into the process, and the shoot demanded a lot physically from everybody involved. Berg also made a very deliberate structural choice. Instead of adapting the broader arc of Marcus Luttrell's enlistment, training, and deployment, the film narrows in on Operation Red Wings and the SEALs' bond with each other. That means you get less biography and more immersion. The movie is less interested in giving everybody a full life story than in dropping you inside one catastrophic mission and not letting you look away. And the realism was not casual. Berg wanted something close to documentary intensity. So Marcus Luttrell lived with him for a month while the script was being written. Berg also embedded with a SEAL team in Iraq, and the screenplay drew from eyewitness testimony, autopsy reports, after-action reports, and Navy incident documents. That's a lot of source material for a movie that often feels like pure blunt force. The actors trained hard too. They went through live fire exercises, weapons and communications work, and the kind of drills summed up as shoot, move, cover. SEAL veterans were there as technical advisors, which probably helps keep things honest at the level of how people move and talk under pressure. They use real military vehicles, and they filmed part of it at elevations around 11,000 to 12,000 feet in New Mexico. Even sitting at sea level, hearing that is enough to make your knees complain a little. The sound design pushed that same inside-the-body realism. Microphones were placed on the actors' clothing, so explosions and bullets would feel like they were happening from within the soldier's own experience, not from some safe cinematic distance. What's striking, and honestly unsettling, is how much real risk came with that pursuit of authenticity. Stunt performers were told to fall 15 to 20 feet down steep mountain terrain without wires or dummies. Several people were injured, so when people talk about the movie feeling punishingly physical, that's not just craft in the abstract. Some of that effect came from a production willing to push very hard, maybe hard enough to make you wince in retrospect. Then the film pivots to its most hopeful note, and it comes through Muhammad Gulab. After so much violence, his rescue of Luttrell becomes the clearest counterpoint the story has. Gulab and the villagers protect an American enemy under Pashtunwali, the traditional code that treats hospitality and moral obligation as binding, even in the middle of war. That idea gives the movie a moral vocabulary beyond combat. Mark Wahlberg said Gulab's heroism was the part that moved him most because it suggested that compassion can still survive inside all this destruction. And that's probably why those scenes land the way they do. They don't deny the brutality, but they refuse to say brutality is the whole story. The movie even makes that distinction visually. Villagers are dressed in lighter colors, while Taliban fighters are shown in darker clothing, making the point explicit that their humanity prevails. And in real life, Gulab paid for that choice. Taliban threats forced him and his family to flee Afghanistan, and they eventually settled in Fort Worth in 2016. So the film's most hopeful thread also carries a very real aftershock. Now this is where the movie gets much more complicated. It presents itself as a true account, but the underlying events are heavily disputed. One of the biggest fights is over the size of the Taliban force. Military intelligence reporting put it closer to 8 to 10 fighters. Luttrell's book described more than 200, and the film shows at least 50. That's not a small difference. That changes how the whole battle reads. Several major action beats were also dramatized or altered. The villagers' firefight with the Taliban didn't happen the way the film shows it. Luttrell crawled rather than walked after the ambush, and the Chinook was likely hit by an Agla missile, not an RPG-7. The portrayal of Ahmad Shah is disputed too. The film presents him as a senior al-Qaeda associate responsible for numerous American deaths, but available accounts describe him more as a local militia leader with Taliban ties, and they do not support several of the movie's specific claims. So the closer you get to the historical record, the more the film looks less like a clean reconstruction and more like a dramatized version shaped for emotional and cinematic impact. That tension helps explain the split in the response to the film. Supporters praised it as one of the most grueling and sustained American combat movies since Black Hawk Down. They pointed to the direction, the sound, the stunt work, the visuals, and especially the way the movie traps you alongside the SEALs. If the measure is whether it makes combat feel chaotic, punishing, and terrifying, a lot of people thought it absolutely succeeded. But the strongest detractors said the relentless action comes at the expense of characterization. They argued you never really learn enough about who these men were beyond their professionalism and loyalty to each other. One critic even called it war porn, comparing its reverent depiction of suffering to the Passion of the Christ. That's a pretty fierce line, but it captures the discomfort some viewers had with how intensely the film dwells on bodily punishment. And that's really the central critical divide. Lone Survivor is very effective at showing what a military operation feels like from the inside, but it's much less convincing if you want deeper inner lives, broader politics, or more context about the war itself. It's also worth remembering that this was a real financial gamble. For a $40 million war drama, the production strategy was unusually committed. Berg accepted the Directors Guild minimum of $17,000 a week. He convinced cast and crew to reduce their fees, and multiple producers personally put in at least $1 million each. That is a lot of faith in a movie where everybody spends much of the runtime falling down a mountain. Commercially, it worked. Lone Survivor earned $154.8 million worldwide, with $125.1 million of that in North America. Its $38.2 million opening weekend became the second largest January debut at the time, which is a pretty strong result for a war film this brutal and this specific. Even the marketing had its own unusual angle. Berg screened the movie for professional football teams and Alabama's football program, leaning into audience response and word of mouth rather than treating those screenings as just routine advertising. So where this leaves Lone Survivor is in a fascinating place. It's a film remembered for brotherhood, sacrifice, and astonishing physical immersion, with one deeply human act of mercy at its center. And it's also a film that becomes less settled, the more you ask how true it really is. That mix is probably why it lasts. It's compelling, impressive, moving in places, and still very much open to argument. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.